Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our seminar on the fascinating subject of the Building Safety Bill and the Fire Safety Bill. My name is Mark London. I'm Head of Construction at Devonshires, and I'm going to be dealing with the occupation phase and the Fire Safety Bill in my section of the talk. But it's fair to say that these two pieces of legislation, one vast in scope and size, and the other astonishingly small, together going to have a very, very significant impact for building owners, not just of higher risk for buildings, but in fact buildings of any size. All multi-occupancy and multi-storey buildings will be captured by the Fire Safety Bill in particular. So we're going to take you through the sort of the main elements of both these pieces of legislation. We've only got 2 hours today, and we could quite easily spend an entire day on just one part of the Building Safety Bill. So it's going to be a fairly quick tour through. I'm delighted to be joined by a host of eminent speakers. We have Andrew Meller, who's a partner at PRP, who I'm sure a lot of you will know and will have had the pleasure of working with. Andrew is an absolute expert on all matters in relation to building safety. He advises the government, the MHCLG, and knows probably more about the Building Safety Bill than most people could hope to achieve in a lifetime. So we're delighted to have Andrew here today. We also have Steve Cooper, again an eminent member of the profession of fire engineer and a partner at Hollis International. Again, a lot of you will have worked with Steve over the years. Steve is going to talk to you about some of the practical elements of the Fire Safety Bill and the Building Safety Bill, the stuff that you're going to have to do, the important stuff. And we're also joined by Nick Billingham, one of my fellow partners at Devonshires, who's going to talk about the very important task of resident engagement and what that means. And finally, I should add, out of politeness, that I'm going to be joined by Yaska Hamilton-Hay, who's one of my assistant solicitors and who is working with me very closely on a large number of building safety cases. And Yaska is going to talk about the Fire Safety Bill. So without further ado, I think what we'll do is if you can save up your questions, we'll see where we are at the end, and we can deal with those questions. If we don't have time, then the panel members will respond in writing to the questions. So we will deal with them, but it just may not be today given the limited time we have. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. And Andrew, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning, everyone. So we're in this period of an enhanced profile of residential building fires. And I hear regularly from speaking to some of you on the call and from other clients that they've had a fire in a flat in the last week or so. It doesn't seem to be spreading very far, but we've obviously had some fairly big fires, not only in residential blocks, but elsewhere. And these fires are not just happening in tall buildings, they're happening in lower rise buildings. This is the fire that happened at Worcester Park and has led to modern methods of construction, particularly timber frame, to be under scrutiny now within government. This is one that happened in the Brighton area. Again, you see that these are lower rise buildings. The fires, we understand, started on balconies, spread into the facades and then up into the roof zone due to a lack of compartmentation and fire stopping, and then spread laterally within the building and down into other parts of the building. What happens, of course, is that when there's a fire, that the other buildings on the development get investigated, and it's quite often the same defects that are found in all the other buildings. So we're not just having to demolish and rebuild one building, we're having to remediate all the other buildings on the site as well. And as I said, of course, it's not just happening to residential buildings fires. We've had a number of hotel fires in the last 2 years, some of which have completely destroyed the hotels. And more recently, we've had the student residential fire. I think that was about 18 months ago now. So besides all the fires happening, we've had in a period of rapidly changing regulations and guidance. And I think the next 24 months, we're going to see a lot of new legislation, a lot of new regulation related to fire safety, and colleagues are going to talk about much of that. But we've already had 3 changes to the approved document in the last 2 years. And we've probably got another 2 changes to come in the next 2 years. So that's 5 additions of the approved document in a 4-year period. All of us working towards one version of this on a project, which might quickly change to another version. So in December 2018, we had the combustible materials ban introduced, which brought combustible materials being banned for buildings with a floor level above 18 meters. In July 2019, we had a new addition in the new format of the approved documents. And the changes in this were meant to deal with the misunderstandings which may have led to some of the issues at the Grenfell disaster in terms of the cladding design, etc. And then in May 2020, we had a further addition, and that part came into force last November, and that related to the trigger height for sprinklers being dropped from 30 meters to 11 meters, and the introduction for the first time of wayfinding signage. And you'll recall the firefighters at Grenfell struggled to understand which floor they were on and which flats they were approaching because of lack of signage. Well, that is now introduced for blocks of flats with a floor level above 11 meters. There was a proposal also to introduce evacuation alarms. Evacuation alarms are a panel in the ground floor that can be used by the fire service for notifying residents on a particular floor or floors and telling them that they will have to evacuate the building immediately. That, as I understand, is being tested at the moment and may be brought in the near future. Why do we know that there's going to be new versions of ADB coming out or further versions? Well, MHCLG over the last 12 months has been consulting and then developing further proposals for the combustible materials ban to include other measures to exclude parts that might already be included and to potentially drop the height from 18 meters to 11 meters. It is at 11 meters in Scotland already. So we can probably sit here and say at some point in England, it's going to drop to 11 meters. We expect this legislation to be in, or the change in the approved document guidance at the start of this year. But because of COVID, etc., much of this legislation we're going to talk about today is delayed. So who knows, but probably imminent, I would say, for a change in the approved document in relation to combustible materials ban. And then why do we know it's going to change again? Because we're aware PRP are undertaking one element of the research for MHCLG, but MHCLG has 12 areas of research happening at the moment, which are looking at the current provisions in the approved document guidance about whether they meet the current industry requirements for the design of buildings, the construction of the buildings, how we manage buildings, and how we now occupy buildings, because things may well have changed, of course, since the approved document was developed a number of years ago. So we've obviously got a lot of discussion about EWS 1 forms, and I think colleagues will cover this in more detail, so I won't get too much detail, but the guidance changes regularly on EWS 1 forms as well. And we had new guidance from the RICS on building heights and the materials which on facades, which EWS 1 forms should apply to from the 1st of April this year. We have got other legislation coming in, and some of it is indirectly related to fire safety, but the one here for in particular consideration is the changes to Part L that will come in later this year and be in the force from April 2022. And that is a stepping stone to the future home standard, which will lead to carbon emission reductions of 78%. I think the point here related to fire safety, of course, there's a few points. One of the reasons we have combustible insulation on facades currently is because of the drive to reduce carbon emissions from properties and reduce energy use. We opted as an industry because market development in rigid insulation foam products to use thinner insulation on buildings for viability reasons, space reasons, etc. So we've ended up with combustible insulation on buildings. As we move forward, we're going to have more stringent requirements under these new thermal performance parts of the legislation. And we're going to be using non-combustible, we're going to be using mineral fiber, which has to be thicker. So that might have a knock-on effect on the external wall thickness, on the viability of projects, on the areas of dwellings, etc. For some reason, it's not moving forward. So I'm going to now talk about the Building Safety Act. And as Mark said, I'm here to talk about the design and construction stages of the Building Safety Act. Of course, the precursor to the bill that's, or the draft bill that's been published was the Dame Hackett review process, and Dame Hackett looked at the building regulations, fire safety in particularly the residential market, and found there were lots of problems which are obviously reported. She made, from memory, 52 recommendations, and I know that MHCLG has taken absolutely every single one of them very seriously and is moving forward to act on those if it hasn't already. So we had the draft building safety bill in July of last year. It is 150 pages long approximately. You need to be a lawyer to understand it, and that's why Mark will be taking you through it rather than myself. But there are 152 pages of accompanying notes from MHCLG, which are much easier for the layperson to understand. And I would recommend, if you're going to read one of them, that's the one that you read, because it gives you actually more information. What we should add here is, of course, this is a draft. It is still being worked on by MHCLG right now. Its introduction to Parliament is delayed for various reasons, but it's not all in there that what is required. So there will be a number of pieces of secondary legislation, other guidance, other policy that will be set alongside this to give us the full requirements for safer buildings. So within the draft bill, a high-risk building is described as, high-risk building means a building of a prescribed description. In other words, it is not described. In the accompanying notes on to the right of the slide, a high-risk building is described as one that has 2 or more dwellings, 2 or more rooms for residential purposes, and student accommodation. At a consultation stage for the safety bill 18 months ago, student accommodation was not included as one that was being considered to be part of this new regime. I believe fully that the fire in Bolton influenced that change. But in any case, the Secretary of State has the power to introduce any other building type at any point before the introduction of the bill, I understand, and whilst the bill is in place as an act. There is the other requirement, is the height of the building. So that's where the uppermost habitable floor is 18 meters above the lowest level of the ground outside the building, or the building contains more than 6 stories. So it was understood that there are seven-story buildings out there that are actually slightly below 18 meters. So it's now 7 stories or above 18 meters. And that 6 stories was also introduced post-consultation. What's not included at the moment are residential care homes, secure residential institutions such as prisons, and temporary accommodation such as hotels, hostels, and guest houses. But I believe, because of all the fires that have happened in care homes and in hotels recently, that may well be looking at these in a greater way and may be introduced before the act comes in or during the first few years. So in terms of buildings in scope, Dame Hackett said that she wanted, or advised government, that buildings in scope for this new regime should be anything with a floor level above 30 meters. Relatively immediately, MHCLG said, no, we're going for 18 meters plus. So Dame Hackett's scope would have had 100 buildings included per year. We build out or develop about 100 buildings above 18 meters that are mixed use and residential, or largely residential in England. Immediately when we introduced the 18 meters, it became 350. But now with this new 6-story requirement that's been introduced, it's approximately 400 new buildings per year. That may not sound a lot, or it may sound a lot, but we've got to think that it is a lot from the start of this legislation, because we've all got to gear up to deliver it. We need a number of new people. But equally, this legislation doesn't apply to new buildings, it applies to existing residential buildings above that trigger height as well. And that's 13,500 existing buildings, possibly 15,000 buildings. Now they've changed it to 16 stories that this legislation will apply to. So we've got 2 regimes effectively. We've got a regime for buildings below 18 meters, which will largely stay the same for planning and building regulations, although colleagues will touch on other aspects of the legislation that will influence those lower rise buildings. And we've got this new regime for these buildings that are over 6 stories or above 18 meters. And once the building's in the regime, it's in that for life until I suppose this legislation is changed or the building is demolished. So we have these varying trigger heights. We've got the Building Safety Act, which applies to buildings with over 6 stories and 18 meters, as I've just said. We've got elements of the Building Regulations Part B and ADB, which are at 11 meters and may change over time as well. We've got the Fire Safety Act, which colleagues are going to talk to you about, which applies to buildings of all heights. So it's a 0 metre threshold. And then we've got EWS 1, which has largely been aimed at buildings over 18 metres, but has been applied to buildings less than that. And then we've got constantly changing legislation. So therefore, a building you actually designed and developed last year compared to one that you design and develop in 2 years may have had to meet different legislation requirements. So we've got a very complicated arena currently, and it's going to get even more complex as we move forward through the next 2 years as legislation is introduced. So the Building Safety Act defines building safety risk as a risk to the safety of persons in or about a building arising from the occurrence as regards the building of any of the following: fire or structural failure. So there are moments on these buildings we're focusing on fire safety and structural safety. And of course, structural safety can be related to a fire. The fire could damage the structure and cause full collapse or partial collapse. But equally, structural failure also could be from a vehicle strike, an explosion, flooding. They are also thinking of seismic action as well. I can't believe there's many places in England where large earthquakes would happen, but that may also be a consideration. The Secretary of State is able to at any time to include any other prescribed matter where it is deemed to be a safety risk across multiple buildings in England. So this little organogram shows you who the duty holders are under this new act. And of course, it is still a bill and this may change, but this is what's being proposed. We have the new building safety regulator, and I'm sure you're all aware now that is going to be the Health and Safety Executive. The Health and Safety Executive is already gearing up to undertake this role. They are appointed under the Health and Safety Act. And importantly to understand, they will be the building control authority for these taller buildings under this regime. Under them, we have three key duty holders: the client, so the client who's the developer of the building, the principal designer, and the principal contractor. The principal designer and the principal contractor are not those that you know currently under CDM regulations. And I'll explain a little bit more about their roles in a short while. So this diagram shows from left to right a typical development process. On the left, we have a design where we're designing the building to get a planning consent. Then in the turquoise section on the design phase, we are doing what we call the detailed design, and we're submitting what we would be doing now in the building regulations application. Then, of course, we're constructing the building on site and completing the building and handing that over. So we have these new three gateways. We have Gateway 1, which will be at planning application stage, Gateway 2, which will replace the building regulations application, and Gateway 3, which will be prior to handover and full completion of the building. So just taking you through the duty holders as an overview. So we have the client duty holder. The client is responsible for making suitable arrangements for managing the building work so as to deliver compliance with the building regulations. They must appoint a principal designer and a principal contractor under CDM 2015 with the necessary skills and expertise, and take reasonable steps to ensure they comply with their duties. So I just told you that the principal designer and principal contractor are not those you know under CDM 2015 for these high-rise buildings under this new regime, but they are still to be appointed under the CDM regulations because that allows government not to create new policy legislation. And again, I'll cover that in a little bit more detail in a while. The client has other duties, but mostly they're going to flow down to the principal designer and principal contractor. But extremely important here at Gateway 3, at the end of the project, there is no longer final notice or completion certificate from building control. What's being proposed is that the client, the principal contractor, and the principal designer will jointly sign a final declaration to say, to the best of their knowledge, the building complies with the building regulations, and that is what will be handed over to the new building safety regulator at Gateway 3. Of course, that brings huge responsibility and obviously for many people, commercial risk. So the principal designer under these new high-rise residential buildings, high-risk residential buildings, again will be appointed by the CDM regulations and is appointed by the client. There is an expectation that they are appointed by the client, being the developer client, through the design and construction stages of the project. There will be no novation of this role to the contractor. So the principal designer's main role is to coordinate, monitor, and manage the pre-construction phase and coordinate building safety matters to ensure that the project complies with the building regulations. To me, that is not a role necessarily that the current principal designer and the regulations can undertake, because I don't believe that one individual has the whole skills to undertake this role. My belief is that it's very likely to be a team of people led by someone who's got very good project management skills and knowledge of building safety and building regulations, but underneath them, they may well have an array of disciplines or people with an array of skills, such as architecture, M&E, structures, and health and safety. Because the principal designer has got to sign at the end of the project to say that the design complied with the building regulations. So they've got to be able to at least have an understanding of how the design proposals met the building regulations. Oh, sorry. The principal contractor equally has a role very similar to the principal designer, but for the construction phase. Their role is to coordinate, monitor, and manage the construction phase and coordinate safety matters to ensure that a project complies with the building regulations. Of course, that also brings commercial risk for those contractors, and one wonders which PI insurers are going to be insuring principal designers and principal contractors for these roles, and that's where we may have a problem where we need to start delivering these roles as an industry. The principal contractor also has a duty in something that's called mandatory reporting. So it's a little bit like whistleblowing in the aviation and gas and oil industry, and that's what Dame Hackett proposed should happen, in that anybody who's on site, including on-site workers, the client, the principal designer and contractor, will have a duty to report within a set time period, say 72 hours, anything that they've seen happening on site, which is a significant life safety risk. And I think that is both applies to construction process as well as changes to the design and construction of the building. For example, if I was to witness as a principal designer when I was on site that the steel work for the building was not properly connected, not properly bolted, there were fixings missing, or that the cavity barriers in the facade were being installed in the wrong way round or with a different product, then I would be duty bound to report that to the building safety regulator through an established mechanism set up by the client on the project. And I suspect there'll be a formal way of doing that. But this also applies to the construction workers on site as well. So Dame Hackett recognised that many buildings do not have sufficient record information, and I think many of you on this will probably concur with that for your experiences through the last few years. We've worked on very few investigation remediation projects where the buildings have a full set of accurate drawings. If they have the drawings, they're not necessarily accurate, and many buildings, as we know, don't have drawings at all. So Dame Hackett proposed that every building should have a 3D model, and that asset data related to the safety matters of particularly facade, fire safety and structure should be assigned to that model. Now, I don't believe necessarily that government will mandate this, but it's certainly a recommendation from myself to be thinking about this on new buildings and probably also on existing buildings. But what will be required is what's called the digital record. You will have to submit a schedule of safety information related to products, which may well include the manufacturer's data, the BBA certificate, the fire test certificates, the declaration of performance, etc., to the building safety regulator at the end of construction of a new building, and very likely for existing buildings when you submit what's called the safety case. So you will need to gather this information and present it in a set format, which probably will be prescribed by government. So moving on to the gateways. The gateway one is the most easiest for gateways, and it is understood that this will be brought in to legislation, into policy this year through planning policy. So it will be ahead of any other requirements within the Building Safety Act legislation. At this point, you will be preparing a fire statement for submission with a planning application. I understand that this will be a standardized form, a bit like the planning application form, which will be completed by one of the developer's consultants, maybe possibly the fire engineer. It will include information on water supply to the building, fire service access, materials on the building, the layout of the building in relation to fire safety and firefighting systems. The building safety regulator will be passed this fire statement, as they will now become a statutory consultee. It's very likely that they will pass that on to the fire service, but they will then decide whether the building from a fire safety perspective can be awarded planning consent. At this point at Gateway 1, as we understand, the duty holders, the principal designer and the principal contractor, are not required to be appointed. Those of you who are working in London, I believe that the requirements under the London Plan for a fire strategy statement are greater than will be required for the fire statement under this new legislation. Gateway 2, if you remember, this is what would have been the building regulations application on these tall buildings. There is some debate and still continues about whether you'll have to design the whole building or whether you can make a stage application approach whereby we typically do that in England already through a conditional discharge, or it's the warranted approach in Scotland where you submit for the foundations, the superstructure, so the main bulk of the building, and then any other items relating to safety afterwards. What may well happen is that the regulator will consider the buildings at a pre-application stage and say, we do want a full design because this is a rather complex building, or this is a more simple building, therefore will allow you as a developer to take the stage approach. Whatever happens, this is a hard stop. You cannot proceed with the construction work on site until you've got approval for the full application or the stage applications from the building safety regulator. At this point, we're expecting to have detailed plans and specifications on fire safety and the structural aspects of the building, certainly more so on fire safety than we typically submit in the first stage of an application under building regulations currently. We'll also have a fire and emergency file, which is a bit like the London Plan fire strategy statement, which looks at the occupation of the building and the ultimate evacuation strategy for that building, and a construction control plan. The construction control plan is produced by the principal contractor, and it is a plan which sets out how the building regulations will be met during the construction work, i.e. what happens if there are any changes to the design or to the construction processes that may make it that it wouldn't actually meet the building regulations. There is something called major changes as well, which is linked to the construction control plan. So let's say, for example, a cladding supplier goes out of business on a Friday night, and we've suddenly got to source a new cladding product to install on the building. Well, because it's a fire safety related element, we will have to apply to the building safety regulator for a major change to get approval to change that product. And that will take time. It will take a number of weeks to get approval and therefore could cause delay to the projects. We've now got the building complete. Certainly for the purposes of the building regulations, it's complete. We might still be decorating, but it's nearly ready to hand over. We understand that this may well be allowed to be a phased handover process, such as that you can hand over parts of the block or individual or multiple floors on the block in a staged way. We're now resubmitting to the building safety regulator everything that we submitted at Gateway 2, but we're making sure that absolutely it is 100% accurate as per the any changes to the design and construction processes. We are now developing a resident engagement strategy, and this really is produced by the developer and should be produced if they're in place by the building safety manager. And Mark will discuss that role in a while. This is not the handbook that goes in the kitchen drawer that tells you how to change the light bulbs and to turn the cooker on. It is how a resident should escape from a building, how they report safety incidents in that building, and how they deal with the fire and life safety systems in that building. So at this point, as we said, and sorry, I've not updated this slide, but it is the client, the principal designer and principal contractor, which sign the final declaration. And that information is very hard to find in the draft bill. And it's also not in the notes from MHCLG, but you will find that in the impact assessment that sits alongside. So that does somewhat need clarification as we move forward. And as I said, you're not allowed to occupy the building until, in whole or part, until the building safety regulator has approved all of this information. So on implementation, there is nothing in the more recent accompanying notes or draft safety bill about implementation as such on transitional arrangements. So I'm taking this from the previous consultation response, where it sets out that when the legislation is introduced, if you're still working on the design of the building and you do not have a full plans building regulations approval, then you'll have to go through the Gateway 2 process. Similarly, if you're on site and you're constructing a building and you've not got a completion or final notice from building control, then you will have to go through the Gateway 3 process. And what's really important to understand here is that there's a lot of information to be prepared to get you through these gateways. And if you don't have that in place, you're going to retrospectively have to gather and produce that. And that's going to delay the development process and the handover of the building. So Mark's going to talk more so about the occupation phase, but I thought I'd just touch on the safety case, because it is said that you will need to provide a safety case for a new building. A safety case is a narrative. It's a statement from the building owner, from the developer at the development stage, stating why the building is safe. And you can't simply state the building is safe. You have to have evidence in relation to fire safety and structural safety. And one of these will have to be produced for those 15,000 buildings we discussed earlier within the first 5 to 10 years of this legislation coming in, and you will have to reproduce it every 5 years. Considering we have very little information about many buildings, there's a huge amount of work to be undertaken here by the industry, particularly by the building owners, to get these safety cases in place. And I understand that the HSE will be issuing guidance following a number of trials on safety case production over the last year. The guidance will be issued soon on what the safety case may consist of. So I'm talking here about building regulations and enforcement. This applies not only to the building, those buildings that will fall under the Building Safety Act, but all building work. So building regulations, which applies to all building work. So that's anything, a household extension or anything that ends a lower rise residential building, etc. There will be amendments under the Building Act. There will be new enforcement notices, and there will be fines and imprisonments leading to non-compliance with those enforcement notices. As I said earlier, building control will and approved inspectors will no longer be the building controller bodies on these high-risk buildings under the Building Safety Act. It will now be the building safety regulator. And equally, there are enforcement notices and penalties, fines and imprisonment for non-compliance through the building safety regulator as well on the taller buildings. Building control is going to be reformed as well. Dame Hackett realised that building control inspectors must also be able to be held to account. And the aim is to create this unified professional and regulatory structure. The building safety regulator will be overarching regulator for all building control processes on lower rise buildings as well. And every inspector, whether they work for a local authority or private inspecting organisation, will be on a national register. Their competency will be demonstrated, and anything they've got in terms of enforcement notices or sanctions against them as an individual will be on that register. Approved inspectors will no longer be called improved inspectors. They will now be called building control approvers. Just a final few slides from me. So there's a lot going on in the industry around competence. MHCLG is looking very heavily at competence, and there are a number of other organisations looking at competence, including all the industry registration bodies. So for me as an architect, the ARB and the RIBA are looking at competence, and we know for certain we'll have to go through more regular examinations to demonstrate our competence, not just in relation to building safety, but in relation to climate change and other matters as well. And I only think that's a good thing. The British Standards Institute, BSI, are actually now at the moment developing new publicly accessible standards, PAD standards, for the principal designer, principal contractor and building safety manager roles. We understand that they will be released for consultation and then hopefully will be finalised in March 2022. So from March 2022 onwards, principal designers, principal contractors, building safety managers will be able to undertake the examinations and be accredited by a third party to be able to undertake those roles. So in terms of preparing for the future, so what should developers and building owners be doing right now to prepare for this legislation when we don't really know what's coming in? So for anyone who's got an existing portfolio of buildings, I would be recommending that you are reviewing your information for those buildings, and you're considering, if you haven't got information relating to fire safety and structural safety, you should be starting to collect it and thinking about what level of data and information you need and how you're going to collect that and how you're going to store that and how you're going to manage that. And again, colleagues such as Steve will talk about that a little bit later. If You also are building owners, you might start to be thinking about recruiting building safety managers. You may well be doing that already, but as I said, you will not be formally be able to recruit a building safety manager until the new training and methodology and accreditation is in place. If you're a developer, I would definitely be recommending you start to look at your briefing documentation and processes. They should be enhanced as required by current legislation, including combustible materials, sprinklers, signage requirements, but also quality assurance processes such as inspections and maintaining records of the fire safety and structural safety measures that are being installed in the buildings. And also the procurement of your consultants and contractors. How do you now check the competency of those, knowing full well that competency requirements are going to change over time, but this may influence new frameworks that are coming out and how you assess competency. That's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'll just take control. Oh, Andrew, you need to give me back control, apparently.
I've just given you back control.
Oh, fabulous. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Well, as you will have picked up from Andrew's excellent summary of the design and construction phase, the overarching duty to work with the building safety regulator and to have all matters approved by the building safety regulator is fundamental to the design and construction phase. It is also fundamental to the occupation phase, which we're going to come on and talk about now. And I'm going to talk about the three principal characters that you will need to learn about in relation to the occupation phase. That's the building safety regulator themselves, the accountable person, and the building safety manager. And all three of those duty holders have significant and far-reaching obligations. So let's talk first of all about the building safety regulator and what the building safety regulator is there to do. Well, fundamentally, they're there to meet the objectives, and the objectives are defined in the Act. They're securing the safety of people in or about buildings in relation to risks arising from buildings. As Andrew has mentioned, the two prescribed risks that currently sit within the anticipated bill are risks of fire and structural failure. But there is every possibility, and indeed every probability, that list will be added to over time as new defects or new types of problems are discovered in tall buildings. The other objective, the other principal objective, is to improve the standards of buildings. That's a very general objective. The building safety regulator's function is not just to whip people into action and to prosecute and to take steps to enforce. The building safety regulator is also there to help the construction industry and to develop safer methods of construction and all sorts of things. Those of you who will have heard about the building materials regulator, which the government are proposing, the idea is the building materials regulator will work with the building safety regulator to do precisely that, improve the standards of buildings through materials. They are required to encourage and assist other duty holders, and by that is the client, the principal designer, the principal contractor, as well as the occupation phase duty holders that I'll come on to talk about. So they will do that through the regular publication of guidance notes and approved codes of practice and other forms of subsidiary regulation as well that will be complementary to the Building Safety Bill and will be designed to assist the duty holders in complying with their obligations. They are required to keep under review the safety of people in relation to risks arising from buildings and the standards of buildings, so they have to keep their ear to the ground. And they will be the repository of new information and new developments within the construction sector in order to ascertain whether those are safe and can be implemented. They're to facilitate the improvement and competence of industry and building inspectors. And Andrew mentioned that we now have the registered building inspectors and the new approved inspector, the building control approvers. And they are now going to have to work under a very rigid regime, actually, where they sign up to professional codes of practice and will be held to those professional codes of practice. And insofar as they breach them, they may well be liable to personal sanction for doing so. So the building safety regulator oversees all of that. And the idea is that building control at local authority level is going to become a lean, mean, efficient, and highly forensic machine. The building safety regulator has to constitute a national residence panel. One of the things that Dame Judith Hackett was very keen on ensuring in her review, and has subsequently come through in the building safety bill, is that residents should have a role to play, not only in things that happen in buildings prior to their construction, but most importantly, what is going on in the building that they're living in. And the idea is that the building safety regulator will have a national residence panel, and will be talking to the national residence panel in relation to things that are to be implemented under the bill. We don't quite know how that's going to work yet. We don't quite know what decisions or level of involvement is going to take place with the residence panel, but we can anticipate that it's going to be significant, not least because you will have to, if you're an owner of a high risk building, you will have to set up a resident engagement plan and possibly constitute a residence panel in order to comply with your obligations under the bill. And Nick Billingham is going to talk about that in due course. So, in discharging those duties and obligations, the building safety regulator can call from assistance from the local authority and the fire and rescue authority. So they have that pool of registered building inspectors and building control approvers to call upon if they need to, as well as the expertise of the fire brigade. When Dame Judith Hackett spoke about a building safety regulator in her report, she envisaged a sort of a three-way joint arrangement between local authority, building control, fire brigade, and the health and safety exec. Now, for cynics like me, that was never going to work. It was too clumsy. So what we've opted for now is a regime that is controlled by the health and safety executive, but with an ability to call upon that expertise as and when it is required. And it seems to me that it's going to be required more often than not, because given the number of buildings that are going to come within the scope of this bill, and the very significant body of work that has to be done for each of those buildings every 5 years for existing buildings, it is going to take a small army of people to review and validate and critically assess that information. And it seems to me that unless the building safety regulator is going to become almost like a construction NHS, it is necessarily going to have to invoke its powers to call upon assistance to enable it to comply with its statutory function. The building safety regulator has possibly the widest selection of enforcement powers that any regulator in the UK currently has. Not only does the building safety regulator have the very significant enforcement powers that exist under the Building Act as amended and the Health and Safety at Work Act, but also a whole phalanx of new enforcement options under the Building Safety Bill, from compliance notices to serious compliance breach notices, to actual offences that I'll come on to talk about a bit later on, that apply particularly in relation to any breach by the accountable person of their obligations. So in terms of enforcement, the idea here was to leave no stone unturned, and in relation to building safety, to give the building safety regulator the widest possible menu of enforcement options to choose from. And that has actually eventuated in the enforcement options available to the building safety regulator are extremely wide. So there is not much that you're going to get away with without being subject to some sort of sanction, whether it's under the Building Act, the Health and Safety at Work Act, or under the Building Safety Act itself. And as I mentioned, the building safety regulator is going to do this with a team of authorised officers. Those authorised officers will also have obligations and duties and can also be subject to sanction. Whether or not those authorised officers are existing health and safety executive officers, or whether they're going to be new ones, I know we know that the building safety regulators for health and safety is rather recruiting at the moment, but it seems to me that we're going to need quite a few authorised officers to enable the building safety regulator to do all the many things that they have to do. So what are they going to do in terms of discharging their regulator? Well, the primary engagement during the occupation phase is going to be through the building certification process. So you're going to get your initial building assurance certificate, which is your license to occupy, when you pass through Gateway 3 following completion of the building and approval of the Gateway 3 safety case and documents. But then you're going to have to apply for your building assurance certificate every 5 years. And in making your application for a building assurance certificate, you're going to have to provide the building safety regulator with an updated safety case, and you're going to have to detail all the things, the material things at least, that have happened in that building since the last application was made. Now, the building assurance certificate itself, it's unlikely, certainly in relation to existing buildings, that a refusal to grant a building assurance certificate will mean you have to evacuate the building. The bill anticipates that the building assurance certificate can be issued with a whole list of obligations and conditions. So the chances are that if your building safety case isn't up to scratch, or some of the information that you will be mandated to provide isn't up to scratch, then you will have a period of time in which to remedy that breach. But ultimately, if you fail to do that, you'll be committing a criminal offence. It is, in fact, a criminal offence under the bill not to apply for a building assurance certificate every 5 years. So it's a key function. The regulator can enforce against any relevant person, and any relevant person are the duty holders that Andrew mentioned, the client, the principal designer and the principal contractor, as well as the duty holders under the occupation phase. So no one is able to hide. The building safety regulator has almost godlike powers to go after people. There is not a single duty holder that is unexposed in terms of their potential liability. As I mentioned, the accountable person, which I'll come on to talk about in a moment, is the person where the buck really stops with them. And there are a number of very specific offences that the accountable person can commit if they don't comply with their obligations. So let's move on to talk about the accountable person. And before I do so, let me just make one observation. In my discussing this with very many clients and in front of a number of organisations, that people have been rather focused on the role of the building safety manager and how that person is going to, all those people are going to be procured and what they're going to do. My view very much is that the central focus, while that is important, the central focus should be on who is going to discharge the obligations of the accountable person, because those are the obligations that really bite, as we'll come on to see. So who is the accountable person? Well, if you own a building, you're the freehold owner of a high-risk building, then you are going to be the accountable person. However, if you are a leaseholder of a part or the whole of the building, and you have obligations to repair any of the common parts, whether it's a common entranceway or the external wall system or whatever it is, you are also an accountable person. So it's rather like the position with responsible persons under the Regulatory Reform Order. Although the bill rather clumsily, in my view, doesn't set out how multiple accountable persons are supposed to deal with this, it seems to me that the same logic that is applied to multiple relevant responsible persons under the RRFO will apply equally to the building safety bill. So where you are one of a number of accountable persons, it will be a matter for you as an accountable person to liaise with the other accountable persons to decide who is going to discharge the obligations. Now, it would be helpful, in my view, and I've said as much to the MHCLG, if they could make that an actual part of the legislation so that everyone is clear, and that may in fact happen. So what is the accountable person obliged to do? Well, fundamentally, they have to register the building with the regulator prior to occupation. So they have to get through the Gateway 3 hurdle, and they have to get their building assurance certificate, which will allow them to occupy the building. Now, there are a number of issues that Andrew touched upon, not least what happens if you've got a contract that has sectional completion, or what happens when you're taking partial completion. All of these things that are common terms and common concepts in construction contracts rather fly out of the window when you're dealing with the need to have a building assurance certificate. It may well be that you can get a building assurance certificate for part of a building. But it's not entirely clear, and we'll have to see how that all pans out. But for most of you who are building higher risk buildings, the concept of practical completion is not going to be the concept that your sales teams will need to concern themselves with, as it currently is. The thing that your sales teams are going to need to concern themselves with is the building assurance certificate and getting their hands on that, because without that, you're not going to be able to lawfully occupy the building. And we just simply don't know how long the building safety regulator is going to take to review the gateway through information. We don't know what the lag is going to be between contractual practical completion on the one hand and the ability to occupy upon receipt of a building assurance certificate on the other. It could be a matter of weeks, it could be a matter of months. We simply don't know, but that's going to cause a huge problem unless the system is efficient and the process is smooth. Now, there is an answer to that, which is that one of the things that Andrew mentioned is the final sign-off, where the client, the principal designer, and the principal contractor all have to sit around the table and sign a document saying that the building complies with the functional requirements of the building regulations. Now, it is likely, in my view, because it's the only practical way to deal with it, that the building safety regulator is going to see that as a sort of a self-certification process. So unless there is something about the building, or unless there is some manifest failure in the gateway through information or the safety case or anything else, then it's likely that on the basis of that joint declaration, the building safety regulator will provide a building assurance certificate. But we'll have to wait and see. We simply don't know. But the building assurance certificate, as I mentioned before, has to be obtained every 5 years, which raises the question, well, you're going to have to record what happens in that building that is material insofar as it may affect fire or structural safety. And how that information looks and how that information is developed and how you as an organisation structure your operations to make sure that information is recorded and captured is all part of the process that you're going to have to go through. So, and this is the fundamental point. It is not the building safety manager who carries out a regular assessment of the risks in a higher risk building, as a lot of people appear to believe. It is the accountable person that has that obligation, not the building safety manager. The building safety manager, as the name somewhat suggests, is there to manage the risks. It's not there to identify them, and it's not there to risk assess them. So the legislation, the draft legislation, is absolutely clear. The buck stops with the accountable person. It's for the accountable person to carry out a risk assessment. And the risk assessment has to be carried out in the usual way. Those of you who are familiar with health and safety law and health and safety practice will know all about the management of health and safety at work regulations and all the other pieces of legislation that deal with the production of a risk assessment, the need to carry out a further risk assessment if circumstances change. All of that stuff applies here as well. And you are going to have to carry out regular risk assessments in relation to fire and structural safety. Now, how you do that in relation to structural safety is a little bit opaque, not least because the structure is rather set in stone once the building has been built. It may well be that the only point of a further risk assessment is where you carry out work that may affect the structure of the building. And of course, you're going to be carrying out regular fire risk assessments anyway, and you're going to be doing far more enhanced fire risk assessments, as we'll come on to talk about. So identifying what those risk assessments are and identifying how frequent those risk assessments need to be is one of the challenges, because of course the legislation doesn't actually say anything prescriptive about that. It simply talks about risk assessments generally. We're likely to see guidance and ACOPs that will develop this further, and perhaps subsidiary regulation that will deal with it as well. But for the time being, it's the accountable person that has to carry out the risk assessments, not the building safety manager. But they do have to appoint a building safety manager to manage those risks. They have, and that has to be done in time. A building safety manager will have to be approved by the building safety regulator. There will be a list of building safety managers, people who qualify through experience or through a specific qualification. And you're going to have to do that, and you're not going to be able to go around and just appoint anyone to be a building safety manager. They will have to go through a fairly rigorous, I think, competency test, and they will have to be, as I say, approved by the building safety regulator. And once appointed, you can't get rid of them other than with approval of the building safety regulator. So the idea is that these people know exactly what they're doing, and they are highly competent individuals. The accountable person has to take all reasonable steps to prevent a major incident. And a major incident is one where there is a significant risk of many deaths, or a significant risk of a large number of people suffering serious injury. So a Grenfell Tower type situation, a horrendous incident. That is a major incident. Now, the problem with that all sounds rather straightforward, but of course, major incidents start from very discrete and very small and perhaps insignificant starting positions. One only has to think about Grenfell Tower and the fire in the flat and how that developed and escaped through the window, and we all know what happened after that. So it's not necessarily the case that major incidents start from obvious or significant risks. They may very well arise from risks that haven't been identified or are difficult. And in relation to concepts of risk, the health and safety law is what it is. So you're not, a risk is something that would be obvious and reasonable to an individual. You're not obliged legally to deal with risks that you can't possibly be expected to identify. So we don't anticipate there being any serious change as a result of the bill to general concepts, legal concepts of risk, proportionality, and things of that nature. But as you can see, that's a pretty scary obligation, and one that may develop out of something relatively benign. You have to develop a residents engagement strategy, and Nick is going to talk about the residents engagement strategy. It's an absolutely fundamental thing, and you have to do that as part of the Gateway 3 process. So unless you have a developed residents engagement strategy ready to roll, you're not going to get your building assurance. You're not going to be allowed to occupy the building. So it is that fundamental. And these are just some of the relevant requirements, and there are a number of others which you can read at your leisure. But why is that important? Well, I mentioned earlier the building safety regulator has the ability to prosecute the accountable person for a breach of any of their relevant requirements, and that is absolutely the case. There are specific offences in the building safety bill that cover this. Now, you have a reasonable excuse defence, which is not a great cover, but it's there. But if you contravene any of those relevant requirements that we've just been discussing and all the others that appear within the bill, and you do so without reasonable excuse, and your failure to comply with a relevant requirement places one or more people at critical risk, that is, at risk of serious injury or death, then you commit an offence, and you can be subject to an unlimited fine. And if you're an individual as an accountable person, you can be subject to a period of imprisonment. Now, the reality is that there are only going to be a small handful of people who are accountable persons as individuals. There is no prohibition for an accountable person being a corporation or a company or a limited liability partnership. They can be a corporate body. But, and this is the crucial point, as an organisation, working out who is going to discharge those obligations as the accountable person is the most fundamental thing that you have to do, because that is where the buck stops. It is those obligations that are the ones that are going to be under the microscope. Because at the end of the day, when something goes horribly wrong in a building, the building safety regulator is not necessarily going to look at the building safety manager. The building safety regulator is going to look at the accountable person. Did they carry out a risk assessment? Was that risk assessment suitable or sufficient? And if it wasn't, then you've breached a relevant requirement. Was there a reasonable excuse for doing that? Well, it's difficult. You have to demonstrate that it was. And did it give rise to a critical risk? Well, if it did, then you've committed an offence. So it's not difficult, and it's not going to be difficult for the building safety regulator to prove a case. So working out how you're going to deal with the accountable person's obligations is absolutely critical to your having a successful occupation phase of your higher risk building. So let's talk about the building safety manager. Well, the building safety manager has to be appointed prior to the occupation of the building, and again, as I've said, only with the approval of the regulator. And what they're obliged to do is this: they're obliged to appoint a nominated person where they're a corporation. The reason being that the building safety manager's name is going to be in the building, so residents have a point of contact, a human being to contact, as opposed to a company. And there's a large debate at the moment about whether or not a building safety manager ought to be a consultancy firm or ought to be an individual. Now, most large organisations are taking the view, rightly it seems to be, that you're better off having building safety managers as employees, so you can properly control them. That seems to me to be an entirely sensible and right approach. However, there are lots of organisations who may only have one or two higher risk buildings where the employment of a building safety manager may well not be justified. The MHCLG anticipating you're going to need one building safety manager for every 4 or 5 buildings. So there are going to be, and there are already, a number of consultancies who are large and small, who are looking to set themselves up as offering a building safety manager service. So they will have to jump through the hoops in due course, will be set by the building safety regulator, but on the assumption they can do that, there is no reason why you cannot appoint an outside organisation to discharge that obligation for you. As I've said, they have to manage the building in accordance with the safety case and the risk assessment, so that is their job. But of course, they can only do that if the risk assessments themselves are suitable and sufficient and adequate and proper. And so, which is why the buck ultimately stops with the accountable person. They have to give the regulator prescribed information at prescribed intervals. So we have mandatory reporting requirements that Andrew mentioned earlier. Now, the shape of this is all going to be developed in subsidiary regulation. So the sorts of things that the building safety manager is going to have to report to the building safety regulator is going to be, and the time frames for doing so, is going to be set out in subsidiary regulation. But we can expect to see obligations on the building safety regulator to report unsafe circumstances in relation to fire and structural safety, and a failure to do so is likely to give rise to a compliance notice and possibly thereafter an offence if that compliance notice is not complied with. They have to maintain all relevant information about the building in a prescribed format. Relevant information is going to be all set out in subsidiary regulation, but it comes back to the golden thread of information. The idea is that you're going to have a consistent, detailed, and transferable body of information about the building that is going to be maintained and updated over the life cycle of that building. Now, that raises all sorts of IT challenges and personnel challenges and everything else, of course, but that is the idea. Whether it's at year 1 or year 44, you're going to be expected to be presented with a significant body of information, a bit like if you're a classic car collector and you're looking to buy a vintage car where you want to see all the receipts and everything else, and it's no different here. So the relevant information will be maintained. It will almost certainly be maintained electronically in the cloud, perhaps, or in a sophisticated IT system. But that, again, is part of the building safety manager's function. They have to operate the complaint system as part of the residents' engagement strategy. So while the obligation to set this up is an obligation that rests firmly with the accountable person, the interaction between the residents and the building owner is probably going to, in reality, take place through the building safety manager. Now, Nick is going to talk about our view on how this should all be set up and what it should look like very shortly. But it's a very, very important part of the entire regime. The idea is that, if you're looking to appoint a planned works contractor that's going to be replacing windows or doing roof work in a high risk building, then you're almost certainly going to need someone from a residents panel or a resident to sit on that procurement to make sure that the resident's voice is heard. So it's all very important, and it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. Now, all of these obligations, and again, this is just a smattering of them, they're not all of them, they're subject to a compliance notice regime. So unlike the accountable person, the building safety regulator can't go straight for the jugular with an offence. What they do is they will serve a compliance notice on the building safety manager, giving the building safety manager an opportunity to put right any breach of their relevant requirements. And it's only if they fail to do that that they will have committed an offence. So that the real nasty stuff, the straightforward offences are pretty much limited to the accountable person. Now, before I hand over to Jessica to talk about the absolutely fascinating fire safety bill, I just want to run through a couple of very, very quick additions, things that are in the bill. So we have new enforcement powers for local authorities. They can now issue compliance notices and stop notices for breaches of the building regulations for up to 10 years after completion of the building. So that is a significant increase in their power. We have, as Andrew has mentioned, new and upgraded building regulations compliance regime with registered building inspectors, building control approvers. That's all brand new. I must confess, I would be very nervous about becoming a registered building inspector or indeed a building control approver, given that the building safety regulator could make my life very, very difficult indeed, and I could end up in prison if I get it all horribly wrong. So it's going to be interesting to see how that pans out, and consequently how the PI market is going to react to it, which in my view is going to be very badly. We have new residence duties, which are extremely interesting and I think quite valuable. So residents have obligations to make sure things in their property are kept safe and work and are not allowed to deteriorate. So, for example, if you have an electrical appliance, you're under an obligation to make sure that that electrical appliance is kept safe. And this is all really to do with giving residents buy-in and making it clear to residents that they have a role to play in this as well. It's not just the accountable person and the building safety manager. They have to make sure that they're not doing things in their property or bringing things into their property that may give rise particularly to a risk of fire. We have very, very useful new powers of entry into premises. So gone are the days where you have to rifle through a tenancy agreement or a lease to see if you can actually go into the property. You will have powers to run off to the county court to get an entry order in circumstances where you need either the accountable person or the building safety manager needs to get into a property for the purposes of discharging their obligations under the bill. Extremely useful and much needed power. And of course, building safety charges, perhaps one of the most controversial elements of the bill. The idea being that the government recognises that doing all the stuff we've been talking about is going to cost a lot of money. It's going to mean that the cost of occupying a building, not least the cost of building it in the first place, are going to be much greater than they would be otherwise. So the idea is that building owners, accountable persons, will be able to lay off some of that cost that they are going to incur during the occupation phase through a building safety charge, which will be in addition to a leaseholder's normal service charge. Now, as you can imagine, this has caused huge uproar. It's all going to be subject to subsidiary legislation, so we don't know what it looks like yet. We don't know whether there are going to be caps on the building safety charge, or whether it's going to mean a net reduction in the normal service charge. We have to wait and see. But the general mood on the street in relation to this is that it's not very nice. But we have to wait and see. So I'm now going to hand over to Jessica, who's going to take you through the fire safety bill.
So we are working on a number of fire safety matters, including investigations by fire and rescue services where following fires at residential buildings, and also where enforcement notices have been issued on defective buildings. So the current fire safety legislation is the Regulatory Reform Order Fire Safety Order 2005, and this applies to all non-domestic premises and also to the communal areas of residential buildings with multiple homes. So the order requires there to be a responsible person, and that means, among other things, the owner of the premises or the person in control of the premises. And the order requires the RP to undertake and regularly review a fire risk assessment. And they also need to put in place and maintain fire precautions that are adequate and proportionate in managing the risk that there could be lives lost in the event of a fire. And if that's not complied with, then the relevant fire authority will seek to enforce the RFO, and they can do that through various measures such as prohibition notices or enforcement notices. However, there were concerns that were raised in Dame Judith Hackett's review, and this was carried out following the Grenfell fire tragedy. The interim report noted that the definition of common parts is not sufficient because it only really applies to areas such as the common staircases, the corridors, and the external doors to each flat. But what it doesn't include at the moment is any aspect of fire safety within the flats, and it doesn't include the outside of the building, such as cladding. So given what we now know about the sheer number of defective buildings that have defective external wall systems, and many of which have come to light following the MHCLG's advice to check your external wall systems, the government's decided that the RFO should be amended in this regard. So the proposed fire safety bill, so this will amend the RFO, and this will mean that the RP must manage and reduce the risk of fire for the structure and external walls of buildings. And this includes cladding, balconies, and windows. They must also manage the risk in relation to entrance doors to individual flats that open up into the common parts. So the bill will therefore be amended, and it will include an obligation on the responsible person to carry out a fire risk assessment of the external wall systems on any multi-occupancy building of any height. So many of you will have already been carrying out assessments to the external walls of your buildings over 18 metres, and this would have been following Advice Note 14 and the subsequent consolidated advice note. However, the new bill will make this a statutory requirement as opposed to guidance, and it shall apply to all multi-occupancy, multi-storey buildings of any height. And Steve Cooper of Hollis will discuss how that assessment should take place. So the amendments will allow the fire and rescue services to take enforcement action and hold building owners to account if they're not compliant in managing these risks. And the Home Office has recently announced that the level of fines, it was going to be level 3, which is £1,000. They're raising it to level 5, which is unlimited. So if an offence is committed, then there's an unlimited fine that could be issued. And these will apply to various offences, including failure to comply with specific requirements imposed by an inspector. And the Home Office has also said that the bill will provide a foundation for secondary legislation to come in. And this is following recommendations from the Grenfell Tower Phase 1 inquiry report. There's a number of different things here, but especially ensuring that evacuation plans are reviewed and regularly updated, and also that personal evacuation plans are in place for residents whose ability to evacuate may be compromised, for example, if they have mobility issues. And also ensuring that fire safety instructions are provided to residents in a form that they could reasonably be expected to understand. So that may mean translating into different languages, for example. So it's still not quite clear when this is going to come into force, but these are quite major changes to the fire safety regime, and so you should begin to plan for it now. And I'm now going to hand over to Steve Cooper of Hollis, who will discuss the technical aspects of both the Building Safety Bill and the Fire Safety Bill.
Hi everyone, thank you. My name's Steve Cooper. I'm Head of Fire Engineering for Hollis. I think, is this It's me, right? Yes. Okay. I've got control. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the building safety bill, just very quickly, because I think that's some way off, and we got some time before that. We know what that finally looks like, and a little bit about some practical aspects of the fire safety bill. So you've heard about the draft building safety bill. It is draft. The last I heard, and I don't know how true this is, but I heard it's the earliest it's going to be enacted will be 12 to 18 months. Mark may know slightly different, but that's what I've heard. And we are waiting for regulations to be produced to enable us to take action under the building safety bill. So a lot of the provisions in there require regulation to be written by sector of state before we know how we're going to implement it. So I'm looking at three particular issues. Section 72, assessment of building safety risk, and Mark did refer to this a little bit a while ago, and it requires the accountable person to assess the building safety risks, reassess those risks at regular intervals, and whenever it's suspected that the assessment is no longer valid, and if directed or when directed by the regulator. So that does beg the question, how often is regular? Should it be every 6 months, yearly, 2 yearly, 5 yearly? There isn't any guidance, and in any other health and safety related legislation where there's an assessment requirement, which is most health and safety legislation, it does require regular reassessment, but it doesn't give any guidance about how regular that needs to be. And a lot can happen in a building, a residential building, in the course of a year. So I think as an accountable person, you'll have to consider how regular you need to review them. And certainly if something changes, it needs to be reviewed. So the question is, will the usual type of fire risk assessment that you have done, is that sufficient? Not in my view, no, it's not. I think this is looking at a more fundamental, a deeper dive into those building risks. And I don't think the fire risk assessments that are currently carried out under the Regulatory Reform Order are anywhere near sufficient. And I think also, I'm asked to look at fire risk assessments to comment on them sometimes. And I think the current competencies of the fire risk assessors probably aren't sufficient to enable them to assess these risks under the building safety bill. So I think there's some issues there. I don't think the BSI publicly available specification 79, some of you may be aware of, and most fire risk assessments I see have been carried out in accordance with this PAS. I don't think it's the appropriate format or the appropriate vehicle to satisfy Section 72 of the Building Safety Bill. I think it needs to be deeper. I think it needs to be more scientific and more from first principles. And I don't believe PAS 79 is appropriate for that purpose. So the question is then, well, can we use ADB, Approved Document B, as a benchmark? And just in case anyone's not aware of Approved Document B, it's basically the technical guidance that's used to demonstrate compliance with the building regulations for fire safety, simply put, I suppose. And you know, for buildings designed to the government's preferred standard for fire safety, surely then that can be used to help demonstrate that the risk is sufficiently dealt with. And I think probably there is some element of that in there. So I think Approved Document B would be a suitable starting point to start looking at those risks and how those risks are addressed. But I think this is going to be something new created. It's not going to be, in my mind, the standard internal fire risk assessments that are done. It needs more thought and more process than that. So I can't say much more about that until there is more advice available from MHCLG on that. Section 73 is the accountable person must take all reasonable steps to prevent a major accident occurring and reduce the severity of the incident. And you must act in accordance with prescribed principles, and you must take necessary steps promptly. And a major incident, Mark did refer to this, is an incident resulting in a significant number of deaths or serious injury to a significant number of people. So we're not talking of 1 or 2 people dying in an apartment, as tragic as that is. That's not a major incident. We're talking about a Grenfell type incident. And we're talking structural failure and or major fire incident only. So as Andrew said, you can have a major fire that causes structural issues. You could, I guess, have a structural issue that causes fire if, for example, there's a structural collapse to some extent, gas mains or gas connections are broken, then you could have a fire. So we're talking of a fairly major incident. So I think Grenfell, Ronan Point, going back to, I think, 68, structural collapse or partial structural collapse following a gas explosion. So I think those are the things, those are the incidents, if I was in this position, I would be looking at to try to identify what things occur that result in major structural or fire incidents in buildings. I think we are, I won't say lucky, I'll say fortunate that we've only had Grenfell as a major fire incident in the recent past in a residential building. There have been other residential buildings damaged or destroyed, but with very few injuries or even no injuries at all. Andrew showed pictures of Worcester Park. Apart from a bit of smoke inhalation, there was no one injured in that building, and yet the building was completely destroyed. So that, that wouldn't, although that was a significant fire, it wasn't a major incident in the terms of the building safety bill. You have to act as an accountable person in accordance with prescribed principles. I don't know what they mean by that. Are they going to prescribe those principles under new regulations, or are they referring to principles that are already prescribed for other major incidents? And there is a sort of health and safety 5 steps to reducing risk type approach. So, but it's not clear. So until these regulations are enacted that puts the bill into force, we are a little bit guessing in the dark really about how we're going to do this. So we looked at section 73, steps to prevent major incident, and I think probably our way to address that, if I was an accountable person, would be starting to look at previous major incidents, predominantly Grenfell and perhaps Ronan Point, something like that. Maybe Barking Riverside, which wasn't a major incident, but did cause significant fire spread and could have turned into a major incident. The next slide is section 74, the safety case report. And this is an interesting one. I think we need to remember that Hackett was head of the health and safety executive, and the language she used in her report and the fundamental principles she's adopted are really from health and safety legislation and from the health and safety executives' practices. So the accountable person must prepare a report containing assessment of the building safety risk, and any steps taken under section 73 must be revised when the risks are reassessed or when further steps are taken. Once the safety case has been produced, the accountable person must notify the regulator, and when requested, provide a copy of that to the regulator. There will be regulations written about the content and form of the report and the way in which it must be given. So is it hard copy, soft copy, BIM, God forbid. So, is this just the fire safety strategy document that might have been produced when the building was designed and built? In my view, no, it's not. It's something very different. I think having a fire safety strategy report will be very useful in this way. This morning, I looked on the HSE's website with regard to guidance on safety cases, and it all relates to hazardous plant, hazardous site, petrochem, nuclear, etc., etc. And in all cases, where they have templates available for these operators to use, they're pro forma based. So I think it may be that the safety case is a pro forma based approach, and they will give you the form and you fill the form in to some extent. It will have to identify the hazards, the risk arising from those hazards, the persons at risk. It may ask you to quantify the risk, what list the risk reduction measures that you have in place, and what the emergency management and the emergency arrangement procedures are. So I think it's going to be a new process for us in construction, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was pro forma based, but I don't think it will just be a form of the fire strategy document. I think it's going to be something completely different, but a good starting point is having the fire strategy document. So for me, if I was an accountable person, I would be at this point trying to pull together all of the past and present fire risk assessments of the buildings that I'm responsible for or I'm accountable for. I would be pulling together the fire strategy documents, relevant drawings, details of systems. If that information doesn't exist, I'd be getting it made available. I'd be making retrospective fire strategies, for example, because all of that information is going to be helpful and useful in doing your safety case report and in demonstrating that you've met the relevant requirements. So I would see this really, until we get the regulations, we are a little bit in the dark still, but I think this is an information gathering stage where the amount of effort and planning you put in now in gathering that information will make your job a lot easier once the bill takes effect. Next one, please, Jessica. So that brings us to the Fire Safety Bill, which is a bill to make provisions about the application of the Regulatory Reform Order where a building contains 2 or more sets of domestic premises. I think it's worth remembering that the Regulatory Reform Order was only ever intended to apply to places of work. It came about as part of the EU Workplace Directive, and it replaced the Fire Precautions Act 1971, which applied to factories, shops, office and railway premises. So it was specifically to protect people in the workplace. Common areas of residential buildings were considered to form part of the workplace of, for example, cleaners, contractors, people who manage the building. So that's how common areas came to be included in the Regulatory Reform Order. It didn't cover the front door of apartments if those apartments or those flats were demised to the tenant, and it didn't cover, obviously, the external walls. So the Fire Safety Bill has 3 clauses. Clause 1, I'll talk about in detail. Clause 2 gives ministers of the government powers to make other buildings fall into the premise, the order, and to make other requirements in the order. And Clause 3 is really about the territoriality, so applied to England and Wales. Clause 1, the existing exception of domestic premises will disapply to the structure, the external walls, the common parts and doors between common parts and domestic premises in any building containing 2 or more sets of domestic premises. So it's quite, as far as extending the remit of the order goes, it's quite a big extension. We've gone from walking around checking fire doors, looking at emergency signage, looking above suspended ceilings. The risk assessment now has got to cover structure, external walls, and all these other parts. Next one, Jessica, please. So the external walls and cladding systems will need to be included in the building's fire risk assessment. External walls in this context include doors and windows and anything attached to the exterior of those walls, including balconies. One imagines brise soleil will also be captured in that, as they were specifically mentioned in the Building Regulations Amendment. But what about if you've got a residential building with retail on the ground floor? What about the walls to the retail? What about the cladding to the retail, the canopies to the retail shop, the retail units? Or if you've got a shop sign with luminous discharge tubes, high voltage, like neon signs, do they have to be covered? It's not clear, it's not specific, but the risk assessment legally must be considered to be suitable and sufficient. And I think, to be suitable and sufficient, you would look at all of that as part of the external walls, including the doors and windows. I hope we get guidance that says laminated glazing isn't really that much of a fire risk, whether it's in windows or balustrades. We don't need any more nonsense like that. So who's able to carry out the risk assessments in external walls? Well, actually anyone. Anyone can. There's no barrier to people calling themselves fire risk assessors or doing risk assessments. I think there is a big issue in that I have question marks about sometimes the adequacy of the internal fire risk assessments, the standard fire risk assessments that are done now to satisfy the RRO. I don't think the competencies and that's the skills and the experience of those risk assessors, even if they are part of a third-party accredited approval scheme, I don't necessarily think the competencies of those risk assessors are going to be sufficient for them to look at external cladding systems, and structure. Structure has to be included in that. I'm going to rely on as-built drawings and just look at the structural calculations done by the structural engineer, if you can find them, and base the assessment on that. I think it's got to be something more than that. And unlike the via risk assessment of the internal parts of the building, you can't assess the cladding and the external walls without actually investigating what's there. The information that's held in as-built drawings and the O&M manuals, if they are available, can't necessarily be relied upon. Quite often that information differs to what we actually find when we do the opening up. But even if it was confirmed that all that information is accurate, you've still got to take account of the cavity barriers and the detailing and the workmanship gone into the external wall system. So, I don't think you can do an external wall fire risk assessment without some element of intrusive investigation into the wall, into the components, the materials, the cavity barriers. So can we use ADB as a suitable benchmark? I think if you've got a building that complied, the external walls met the requirements of ADB, certainly the new stricter ADB with a ban on combustible materials, then subject to some checking, I think that's a good benchmark to start from. ADB doesn't explicitly deal with risk, it deals with compliance, but there is an implicit link in there that the risk must therefore be acceptable, because that's what MHCLG considers necessary. So I think ADB is a good starting point, but there has to be some element of risk assessment based into that. And there is a new BSI publicly available specification in draft form at the moment. That's 9980, and its title is something like Appraisal and Assessment of External Wall Systems in Existing Buildings. So it's written specifically to address this, and it should have been out for public consultation in February, with the aim of being available for people to use thereafter. It ran into some issues in that I'm on the steering group for this standard, and when we reviewed it, I think there was something like 400 comments that had to be dealt with, and we spent 2 days solidly going through every comment, trying to bottom them out. So it's gone back to the authors for another review and amendment, and then it will come back to the steering group again. And I think the earliest it could possibly be out for public consultation will be the end of this year, possibly September. It is a problematic document. I have some reservations about it and how it will be used, purely because I've seen how PAS 79 has been used, and this is of a similar, slightly different approach, but of a similar nature. But it will give a formalised process for people to assess the external walls of buildings. And it's aimed at anyone to use, provided they're reasonably competent. So it's not just fire engineers. So it could be used by a fire risk assessor, or by an architect, or by a building surveyor, and that does trouble me slightly, if I'm honest. But that will come out it may come out in the fullness of time. PAS 79, there was a part 2 issued, or due to be issued, which dealt specifically with risk assessments in dwelling buildings, housing buildings. That was withdrawn very quickly by BSI after some criticism and comment, not least of which was the opening statements of phase 3 of the Grenfell inquiry. So I think, again, 79 will be under scrutiny, 79 part 2 will be under scrutiny, and PAS 9980 will be under scrutiny as a result of the findings and the comments made under the next stage of the Grenfell inquiry. So I think we've got quite an interesting period ahead of us. The fire safety bill puts the MHCLG guidance notes, which in my view were sort of not much help, to be honest. It now gives them some legal standing in that they can be enforced to some extent under the regulatory reform order as amended. So I think we've got some interesting times ahead of us, not least of which the building safety bill in a year's time maybe, but the fire safety bill in a few months. So we're going to have to get our heads around this. Who's going to do the fire risk assessments, the cladding, the external walls, the structure? I don't know. It can't be fire engineers. There's not enough fire engineers to go around to do it. Can the fire risk assessors we've currently got available to do it? Who knows? It's going to be a bit of a turmoil to begin with, I think, but no doubt we'll get through that. So I think that's me, Jessica. Thank you very much.
Hi there, everybody. As Mark said at the outset, I head up the housing management and property litigation team at Devonshires. Some of you may know me already. And my involvement and my team's involvement in the Building Safety Bill and also the Fire Safety Bill really relates to the impact of both pieces of legislation on residents. The context for this obviously relates to the Building Safety Bill, as Mark's alluded to already. One important element of the Building Safety Bill is the requirement to have a resident engagement strategy, and that's what I'm going to look at over the next 5 to 10 minutes. We need to make sure that you've got time for your various questions to be answered, so I'll aim to finish by 10:02. So just to put it in context, the requirement for a resident engagement strategy in the bill obviously emanates originally from Grenfell, and during the subsequent inquiry, a lot of evidence has been led relating to the lack of resident involvement, an alleged failure to listen to residents on the part of the TMO, a lack of knowledge about fire safety in the building amongst residents, the fact that complaints were ignored, and generally tenants' voices were not being heard. And tenants' voices has been a theme throughout the inquiry, the lack of a tenant voice, as it were. And of course, this has then fed into the Social Housing White Paper published in November last year, the Charter for Social Housing Residents, which picks up on the Building Safety Bill and the Fire Safety Bill, but also heavily on the idea of the residents having a voice, empowering the tenant voice, reinforcing the regulator's remit in relation to residents' rights, and strengthening consumer regulation. And we're due a consumer regulation review, which is set to start later. We'll look at amending the consumer standards, which are all about focusing on residents, and in particular focusing on changes to enhance regulation in relation to resident safety. And then of course we've got the Building Safety Bill, which we're talking about today, which contains specific provisions requiring engagement with residents in higher rise buildings. And this is to ensure that residents have oversight and knowledge, so an element of scrutiny, but also that they're provided with the relevant information in order to exercise proper scrutiny. So what does the draft bill say about resident engagement? Well, it's the various provisions appear at clause 82 of the draft bill, and they provide for the appointment of the accountable person. Obviously, Mark has talked about the accountable person, or more properly, accountable people, because he's already mentioned the complications that we face where we have the potential for multiple accountable people or accountable persons in one block. So, one of the first questions is, who's going to be responsible for preparing the resident engagement strategy, or could we face a rather ridiculous situation where there are different resident engagement strategies for the building? I mean, that mustn't happen, and that is one of the debates that's going on at the moment, and that's certainly feedback that's gone back to MHCLG about the whole issue of accountable person. But the accountable person must prepare a resident engagement strategy, and the primary function of the RES is to promote participation of residents in making building safety decisions. So they must be consulted, and they must be party to decisions which are made by the accountable person in relation to the safety of the building. And a building safety decision is defined in section 82 or clause 82 as a decision by the accountable person or the building safety manager about the management of the building, and which is in connection with the duties of the AP or the BSM under the bill. And the resident engagement strategy itself, which we obviously anticipate will be and will have to be a written document, must contain certain information. So the information which will be provided to residents about decisions relating to management of the building, when residents can be expected to be consulted about those decisions, arrangements for consultation, what form consultation will take, and obtaining views from residents, and the means for measuring and keeping under review the methods used by the AP as part of resident engagement. The strategy has to be reviewed by the accountable person at prescribed intervals and revised where necessary or appropriate. And once produced, the strategy has to be given to each resident aged 16 or over, where the accountable person is aware of the resident and has taken reasonable steps to be aware of the residents in the building. I mean, one of the elements of the resident engagement strategy, or leading up to it, will have to be a proper audit of every building to find out, as far as possible, as far as is reasonably practicable, exactly who is occupying, not just the leaseholders or the tenants on the tenancy agreement or lease, but their household members. And then the Secretary of State may make regulations about the content of the resident engagement strategy and the way it's to be given. Those are obviously regulations yet to be passed, yet to be laid before Parliament, or even produced in draft. And I'll come back to that as one of the criticisms of the legislation, of the elements of this resident engagement strategy in Section 82. Clauses 83 to 84 don't directly relate to the strategy, but they do impact on the strategy, because they provide for the prescribed information to be given to residents. That prescribed information has yet to be determined, because it will be determined by regulations which have yet to be issued. And it refers to the accountable person's obligation to establish a complaint system, which will be operated by the building safety manager in the building to deal with complaints about building safety risks, or the compliance of the accountable person or the building safety manager with their duties. As I say, Secretary of State can issue regulations in relation to both the prescribed information, but also in relation to the complaint system, how to make a complaint, timescales for dealing with complaints, and when a complaint may be referred to the building safety regulator himself or herself. Now, as the speakers have already mentioned, the Building Safety Bill is actually a draft bill. It's not been laid before the House of Commons yet. Draft bills are not that common. The idea of a draft bill is for government to put what they propose in a bill before draft bill to go through what's called pre-legislative scrutiny. And that pre-legislative scrutiny takes place usually in front of a select committee. And that's exactly what happened here last autumn, when the MHCLG Select Committee perused and commented on the draft bill. And the idea is that their comments go back to government, and they then play around with the bill before it's actually presented to Parliament. And the key elements of the report, the recommendations from the Select Committee, were, first of all, a rethink on the proposal to recharge remediation costs to leaseholders. And this is the controversial element that Mark talked about, highly controversial. And what government has done is it really kicked the can down the road and said, no, that's something that's going to be dealt with in the Building Safety Bill. The other criticism is that there needs to be more detail in the bill, rather than a lot of stuff being hived off to statutory instruments, i.e. regulations to be passed in the future, because not just with resident engagement strategies, but throughout the bill, we're going to be reliant on the detail in regulations. You probably appreciate that over the last 15, 20 years, increasingly government issues and passes what we'd call framework legislation, where much of the detail is then passed by regulations. A good example of that is obviously the Coronavirus Act, and complaints in that context go to the heart of how regulations can be passed by government with much less scrutiny of Parliament than primary legislation. So that's one of the criticisms, that we're going to have to wait for the regulations which govern a lot of this stuff, including the resident engagement strategy provisions. And then there's a concern about just how onerous these obligations might be on the accountable person. And the more pressure you put on the accountable person, the risk is that, that it will be inadequately implemented. So it's getting the balance right between something that's too light touch and too heavyweight. And the other constructive criticism from the committee is that it establishes a top-down model rather than empowering residents from the bottom. I'll come on to what TPAS has to say about this, the Tenant Participation Advisory Service. But definitely, if you're going to be empowering residents and empowering the tenant's voice, or the resident's voice, then really you'd think you would do that by a bottom-up model, starting with the residents, rather than trying to impose something from above. There's an issue about the definition of resident. Select Committee concerned that it might exclude certain occupiers, and a suggestion that government should consider facilitating formation of residents groups in every higher risk building, and that there should be something about this in the bill itself. So just briefly on our commentary, what do we think? Well, the first point is that there's a critical need for a realistic resident engagement framework, which is workable and effective and engenders trust. So much trust of residents was lost through Grenfell and subsequent fires which have taken place, that gaining residents' trust is going to be crucial. Putting off detail in regulations which are going to be passed down the track, risks a disjointed and ineffective outcome. If we consider the issues now, we're more likely to have a better and more effective approach to resident engagement. And the point I've already made, we need to get a balance between robust requirements, which are enforceable and avoid building owners paying lip service to the requirements, against making the obligations so onerous that engagement is deliberately diluted, or accountable persons try to avoid the obligations, or simply just do the bare minimum by ticking the boxes rather than actually using engagement in a positive way. Now, from our perspective, our background is in social housing. We've been advising social housing landlords for 40 years plus. There's an opportunity here for the social housing sector to get really stuck in, because social housing sector has the experience of resident engagement. It's one of the regulator's consumer standards, the tenant involvement and empowerment standard. So this is a real opportunity for registered providers to get involved, and that is what TPAS is doing, and I'll come on to that in a second. And also in protecting their own interests as leaseholders in Section 106 and other head lease arrangements, where the RP may be an accountable person or may not, depending on the precise structure of the leasehold arrangements in blocks, and it does differ significantly between developments. So we've been working with TPAS, the Tenant Participation Advisory Service, for the last several months. Michael Hill, who's their business development director, is working with a number of organisations, including a significant cohort of social landlords, on developing resident engagement strategies. And I say resident engagement strategies because it is clear that one size doesn't fit all. Our resident engagement strategies are going to differ from block to block if they are going to be effective at all. So this is the bottom-up approach rather than a top-down model. And Michael has been, inundated with registered providers providing, copies of their resident engagement strategies, which they've drafted. And he's gone back and said, well, that's all very well, but I mean, how's this going to work in practice? You really need to, at best, you can use this as a framework to build on in respect of each block that you work on. And really what you should be doing is consulting with your residents now about what they think the strategy should look like. It needs to be resident-led. And of course, what comes in front of an effective resident engagement strategy is having existing effective resident engagement anyway. I mean, it sort of, it sounds tautological, but unless you are already engaging with residents and you have a resident engagement process, then you're not going to be able to develop a specific resident engagement strategy which satisfies the bill and goes beyond. Remember, we want to go beyond the bare minimum in dealing with this and not just pay lip service. So social landlords and other landlords who are not used to dealing with resident engagement are going to start having to build in and bring in in-house expertise. And finally, the most important is really bringing all residents together. We mustn't forget that we're talking about leaseholders and tenants, and I mean, of course, it's leaseholders who face these massive contributions towards fire safety costs. And you know, we must remember we're talking about residents, not just leaseholders and tenants, and that raises its own challenges in terms of the different priorities of leaseholders and tenants. Leaseholders, you know, obviously going to be concerned about the building safety charge, which will cover a lot of this work. So that, you know, bringing those two groups of people together to build a coherent resident engagement strategy is going to be a real challenge. So, you know, resident engagement experts within housing associations, with the registered providers and other landlords are going to have their work cut out. So that's really me. And I'm going to throw this back now to Mark, who will presumably you'll be leading on questions, Mark.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nick. I've just here we go. It's better. Yes, well, and thank you to all the speakers. I suppose the things to really take away from what we've discussed this morning is that there is an awful amount of stuff to grapple with here, both in terms of the planning, the construction, the occupation of tall buildings, resident engagement strategies, how you actually carry out the risk assessment. So the obligations themselves are, I think, onerous and in many respects are underdeveloped for the reasons that Nick has mentioned, namely that a lot of the stuff that we're going to have to do is apparently going to be set out in subsidiary regulation that we haven't yet seen. But there's a fundamental question here, it seems to me, which goes to the heart of even being able to comply with these obligations, which is who are we going to get to do it? Who are we going to get to help us with it? Where do all these professionals, where do all these experts, where do all these qualified people come from? Now, it may well be that in 10 or 15 years' time, if we're having the same conversation, there will be courses and university qualifications and all sorts of other things that you may be able to do to allow you to do some of the things that the fire safety bill and the building safety bill require. But at the moment, as we sit here today, there is an absolute problem because insofar as the fire safety bill is enacted, we're on earth going to find the people to carry out those risk assessments. And I think the point that Steve made was absolutely right. The government have kind of shuffled this question away in the same way they've done it with the EWS. The idea is that you can do a course with our ICS to enable you to do. Well, that's not going to cut it, it seems to me. If you're going to be making a decision about whether an external wall system is safe for the purposes of Regulation 8 of the RRFO and the structure is safe, then you have to have quite a detailed understanding, not only of fire engineering, but also of structure and the way buildings are designed and constructed. And one only needs to look actually at the EWS1 form itself to see the differential between assessing an external wall system that comprises of materials that are of limited combustibility and the assessment of an external wall system that contains materials that aren't of limited combustibility. One, you simply have to be a surveyor or an assessor who understands fire and understands construction and the nature of materials. On the other side, you have to be something akin to a fire engineer. And if you're not a fire engineer, I'm not quite sure what you're supposed to be. So it seems to me that it's all very well imposing these quite dramatic obligations on building owners, but at the same time, providing no realistic guidance in terms of who is going to be able to do it and how it's going to be done is, I think, problematic. There's also another fundamental problem here, which is the PI insurance market. Those of you who, like me, spend their entire days dealing with construction matters will know very well that the insurance industry is running away from the construction sector at a rapid rate of knots. Anyone who requires professional indemnity insurance, who's an architect or a consultant, will have seen their premiums skyrocket in the past couple of years. Not only that, but they will also have seen very strict prohibitions written into their cover. So we now have the bizarre situation where consultants who carry out contract administration roles are not able to give advice on fire safety. So the PI market is in a state of flux in relation to these issues. But the PI market has to be there for a lot of this stuff to actually happen, because people are not going to want, or organizations are not going to want to take on these obligations without having some measure of protection for insurance. So there's a lot to talk about, and I hope you found it very interesting. We have got lots of questions, and we've run out of time. So what I'm going to propose that we do is that we will answer those questions. So I will divvy them up with the panel members, and we will answer the questions that have been issued, and we will put them on our webinar platform so everyone can see them. And we'll aim to do that over the course of the next couple of days. So I'm sorry we've not had time to turn to questions, but as I said right at the very outset, this is a hugely complex and very, very significant body of legislation, and we've only really just scratched the surface this morning. So it leaves me, therefore, to say thank you very much to my fellow speakers, to Steve, to Jessica, to Andrew, to Nick, for their input, which is excellent as always. And I wish you all very well, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Friday. The sun's shining outside. There's of course a weekend tomorrow, so reasons to be cheerful. So thank you all very much indeed, and enjoy the rest of your day. And I hope to talk to you all soon. Thank you very much.